The singing wilderness has to do with the calling of the loons, northern lights, and the great silences of a land lying northwest of Lake Superior. It is concerned with the simple joys, the timelessness, and perspective found in a way of life that is close to the past. I have heard the singing in many places, but I seem to hear it best in the wilderness of Lake Country of the Quetico-Superior, where travel is still by pack and canoe over the ancient trails of the Indians and voyageurs. I have heard it on misty migration nights when the dark has been alive with the high calling of birds, and in rapids when the air has been full of their rushing thunder. I have caught it at dawn when the mists were moving out of the bays, and on cold winter nights when the stars seem close enough to touch. But the music can even be heard in the soft guttering of an open fire or in the beat of rain on a tent. And sometimes not until long afterward when, like an echo out of the past, you know it was there in some quiet place or when you were doing some simple thing in the out of doors. I have discovered that I am not alone in my listening, that almost everyone is listening for something, that the search for places where the singing may be heard goes on everywhere. It seems to be part of the hunger that all of us have for a time, when we were closer to lakes and rivers, to mountains and meadows and forests than we are today. Because of our almost forgotten past, there is a restlessness within us, an impatience with things as they are, which modern life with its comforts and distractions does not seem to satisfy. We sense intuitively that there must be something more. Searching for panaceas, we hope, will give us a sense of reality, filling our days and nights with such activity and our minds with such busyness that there is little time to think. When the pace stops, we are often lost, and we plunge once more into the maelstrom, hoping that if we move fast enough, somehow we may fill the void within us. We may not know exactly what it is we are listening for, but we hunt as instinctively for opportunities and places to listen as sick animals look for healing herbs. Even the search is rewarding, for somehow in the process we tap the deep wells of racial experience that give us a feeling of being part of an existence where life was simple and satisfactions were real. Uncounted centuries of the primitive have left their mark upon us, and civilization has not changed emotional needs that were ours before the dawn of history. That is the reason for the hunger, the listening, and the constant search. Should we actually glimpse the ancient glory or hear the singing wilderness, cities and their confusion become places of quiet. Speed and turmoil are slowed to the pace of the seasons, and tensions are replaced with calm. I remember vividly the first time I heard the music. It was near the tip of a bold peninsula that reached far out into Lake Michigan, and though I was only 7 at the time and knew nothing of the need of solitude or the hunger I've known since, the response was there. The moan of foghorns and the deep-throated whistles of lake boats were part of my childhood dreams. We lived inland, and I used to lie awake at night and listen to them far out in the dark and wonder at the mystery of the night that engulfed them. The time came when I felt I must go to the lake through the forest that lay between, see for myself the open reaches of water, the ships whose voices I had heard, the waves and cliffs of the coast. One day, all alone, I started out through the woods I had never traversed. At the time, there were lynx and wildcats, and I had heard gruesome stories of how they lay in wait to pounce on wanderers passing through. I ran most of the long, winding trail, and when I burst at last out of the gloom, I was frightened and breathless. Before me were space and a sparkling blue horizon, with no land as far as I could see. An abandoned pier reached out from the shore, and I picked my way over the huge blocks of stone to its very end. There I found a deep well of clear water down between them. A school of perch darted in and out of the rocks. They were green and gold and black, and I was fascinated by their beauty. Seagulls wheeled and cried above. Waves crashed against the pier. I was alone in a wild and lovely place, part at last of the wind and the water, part of the dark forest through which I had come, and of all the wild sounds and colors and feelings of the place I had found. That day I entered into a life of indescribable beauty and delight. There, I believe, I heard the singing wilderness for the first time. I kept the pier a secret and stole away there as often as I could. It was the answer to all of my childish desires, a place of magic and wonder which belonged to me alone. My perceptions were uncluttered. My impressions were pure and uninfluenced. My feelings of closeness to nature and of sympathy with creatures of the wild were true feelings. In them, I know now, was that ancient realization of oneness so hard to know or recognize as life becomes more involved. John Masefield, in speaking of his own first contact with what he called the greater life, said, "I believe that life to be the source of all that is of glory and goodness in this world, and modern man not knowing that life is dwelling in death." Some years later, I discovered a stand of virgin forest known as the Northwest Corner. Here were tremendous trees, the last of the old primeval stand, and on the ground, huge moss-covered logs, soft and spongy with decay. This spot was different from any other I had known, even more mysterious than that pier on Lake Michigan. I used to tiptoe into that timber and creep stealthily from bole to bole, thrilled with strange and indefinable sensations, some of fear and some of wonder and delight. Those ancient trees, the green-gold twilight among them, the silence of that cushioned place did something to my boyish soul which I have never forgotten. Another time I found a spring hole at the headwaters of a little river I knew. A shelf of rock overlooked the pool, and from it I could look down into deep, crystal-clear water. Around it stood tall trees, and at one end was a little sand beach where a trickle of a creek came in from the bog above. It was quiet there, and the shadowed pool was smooth and unruffled. A school of speckled trout lay just below me, and when I tossed a pine cone onto the surface, they rose as one, and the pool became alive with their splashing. That pool, the rising trout, the silence there were a bit of primitive America, untouched and unseen except by me. There, too, I heard the singing wilderness. The first of such experiences, they were the forerunners of countless others, and gave me a desire that led me into the wilderness regions of the continent in the hope that I might hear the singing again. Since those early days, I have known the mountains of the east and west, the cypress swamps and savannas of the south, the muskegs of the north. Always there has been the search and listening, not only for me, but for those who have been with me. And I have found that whenever I have renewed in even the slightest way the early sense of communion and belonging I knew as a child, whenever I have glimpsed it only for an instant, the glory I knew then, happiness and joy have been mine. The Singing Wilderness by Sigurd F. Olson in his book of the same title, published in 1956. This was how Sigurd Olson introduced readers to his first book, published in 1956, The Singing Wilderness. He had not been an unknown person at that point. He had been writing for a number of magazines and had been a successful canoe guide in the Boundary Waters region of Minnesota and an educator. But this was the beginning of a new career for him, and it's what we will discuss today in Sigurd F. Olson, The Meaning of Wilderness. Sit back and stay tuned for the next edition, the next episode of North Country History with Rob Berg. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Hello. Welcome to North Country History with Rob Berg. If you're tuning in this week expecting to hear me speak with interpreter and naturalist at Hartwick Pine State Park, Craig Kasmer, about the wildlife of the forest, unfortunately, we've had to postpone that episode for a couple of weeks or so. So in its place today, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite outdoor writers, Sigurd F. Olson, who was born in Chicago in 1899 raised in Wisconsin in a number of small communities, but was best known for living in Ely, Minnesota, up in the very northeast corner, the arrowhead of Minnesota, north of Lake Superior, where he taught first at Ely High School and then at Ely Junior College, and was later the dean of the college, and was a canoe guide, owner of a canoe outfitter, and became one of the leading voices of conservation and the preservation of wilderness in the United States in the 20th century. I was first introduced to Sigurd Olson by my friend Ben Carr, who with his wife Pam owned the Michigan Snowshoe Center in Roscommon, Michigan. This was the early 2000s, and every year Ben would host the Winter Trails Day at North Higgins Lake State Park. And it was a way to introduce people to snowshoes. He'd have a lot of different snowshoe vendors out there, and people could try out snowshoeing and would get a chance to kind of walk the trails or just kind of bushwhack on their own around the park. And because I had the CCC Museum and the Higgins Lake Nursery there, I was asked by Ben to take part every year, have the buildings open, give a history of the site, and let people get an idea of the importance of the site for conservation and reforestation in Michigan, which you heard in a previous episode on the birth of reforestation. So Ben became a good friend of mine during that time. This was the early 2000s, and through him, I became a great lover of snowshoeing. And he introduced me through, because we sharing a lot common interests, he introduced me to the writings of Sigurd Olson. And that led me to, in 2005, to do a pilgrimage to Ely, Minnesota on a fall vacation that I had. Actually went out to Iowa to visit friends, and I headed all the way north on I-35 to Duluth, and then further north up to Ely, where I camped. I heard wolves at night. That was my singing wilderness, and got to experience some of the feel of the Boundary Waters area. Although I wasn't canoeing, I was there hiking and camping. It was such a lovely place, and really it put Sigurd Olson as kind of one of my important people in my life that I had to follow, that I've read many of his books. And as I mentioned, he was born in Chicago in 1899. His parents were from Sweden. His father was a Swedish Baptist minister, but they lived in They lived in Wisconsin. Initially, along on the Door Peninsula, jutting out into Lake Michigan, as he mentions in the opening essay there of The Singing Wilderness. The Olsons then moved to Prentice, Wisconsin, and then further north to Ashland on Lake Superior, where Sigurd graduated from high school and then went on to study at Northland College and then at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His study at both of the schools included agriculture, botany, and geology. And then later he went to graduate school at the University of Illinois, getting his master's degree in ecology. In 1921, Sigurd Olson went on his first canoe trip in the Boundary Waters canoe area of near Ely, Minnesota, where he would go on to become a school teacher at Ely High School, and later teaching science at Ely Junior College, where he would eventually become the dean of the college. In 1921, he went on his canoe expedition, and then later that summer, he married Elizabeth Dorothy Ehrenholt, and the two of them spent their honeymoon on another canoe trip in the Boundary Waters. As a young family in Ely, he spent his summers working as a canoe guide, and later as co-owner of a canoe wilderness outfitter in Ely. The Olsons, Sigurd and Elizabeth, had 2 children, Sigurd T. Olson, Sig Jr., and Robert Olson. He continued to, or during this time, not only did he teach and lead canoe trips, but he began writing articles, mostly about wilderness, about the outdoors, guiding canoes throughout the boundary waters. And he really fell in love with that area. I think he already had at the time of his first canoe trip. And it was through his writing that he shared the importance of wilderness and the preservation that he felt was necessary for the boundary waters of what was called the Quetico-Superior region, Quetico Provincial Park in Ontario, and across the international border, Superior National Forest of Minnesota. And it was this area that he would push to become first a roadless area and also to ban airplanes flying over it, particularly for fly-in fishing onto the many lakes and rivers that crossed through the boundary waters. And eventually, in the early 1970s, it would become the boundary waters canoe area wilderness, an officially designated wilderness as part of the U.S. Forest Service, the Superior National Forest. Sigurd Olson really was one of the significant voices for wilderness preservation, for environmentalism in the 20th century. More people know about Aldo Leopold, his contemporary, but Olson's voice was very important through groups such as the National Parks Association and the Wilderness Society, where he served as president of both organizations at different times. He was an advisor to Stuart Udall, the Secretary of the Interior for John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson during their presidencies. So he really helped to shape the idea of wilderness and the importance for it. Why am I doing an episode on Sigurd Olson? Well, his resume is enough to understand why he's an important person to talk about. He comes from the Great Lakes region, so it certainly falls under the auspices of the region that we're here. He was born in Chicago, raised in Wisconsin, and lived his adult life in Ely, Minnesota. And of course, also the canoeing that they did, the border was there, but it was very much a fluid border, and went into the Quetico area, Quetico Provincial Park of Western Ontario, quite often during his trips. So we're looking at 3 areas of the 4 that we talk about here in the Great Lakes region. The only thing lacking is Michigan. But he'd been to Michigan often during his trips, during his lifetime. But we'll focus on Ely, Minnesota for this episode today. I was first introduced to the writings of Sigurd Olson in the early 2000s by my friend Ben Carr. Ben and his wife Pam were the owners and operators of the Michigan Snowshoe Center, a snowshoe outfitter, one of the largest retailers of snowshoes in Michigan, and probably, if not just Michigan, maybe the entire country. And when I met Ben, it was through what was called Winter Trails Day. And every year in January, Ben would host at North Higgins Lake State Park, where the Higgins Lake Nursery and the CCC Museum are located, a day where people could be introduced to snowshoeing. Ben would have a number of vendors, of snowshoe vendors there, with snowshoes for people to try out if they've never done it before, or if you had your own snowshoes, come out and enjoy the day with others snowshoeing, and give you an idea, a taste of the greatness of snowshoeing. I love snowshoeing, so you can kind of tell here the way I'm talking about. And Ben contacted me to have to to be there at the site to talk about the history of the nursery and being the site of reforestation and the Civilian Conservation Corps and the work they did. It really tied in with the recreation in Michigan, and particularly winter recreation in that area. The CCC did so much for creating recreation sites in the 1930s. But so I got to become good friends with Ben and Pam. And through just conversations with Ben, we realized we were kindred spirits. And he introduced me, he told me about Sigurd Olson and the writings that Olson had in his various books, and told me like what books I should look for to try out to read first. And the Singing Wilderness, the one from the introductory essay here that I read at the start of the podcast, was Olson's first book, published in 1956. But prior to that, Olson was writing articles for a number of magazines, Field and Stream and other outdoor magazines from the early 1920s or mid-1920s on into the 1950s. And he was kind of a frustrated writer for a while. He really wanted to have books published, and it took until Alfred A. Canoe published The Singing Wilderness in 1956 for his work to finally make it for, a wide readership. But so Ben told me all about Olson's books, and I started reading them. And Olson wrote 9 books on his own, and then there were other ones published of his writings, such as The Meaning of Wilderness, which I borrowed the title of the episode from, which was edited by David Backus, who was Sigurd Olson's biographer. And it's a compilation of the various writings that were done for magazines and speeches as well, ones that had not really been published widely prior to that point. But so I read a lot of these, and I realized that what Olson believed in, his singing wilderness, his listening point, which I'll talk about here later on, they really hit me right to the heart. And it's part of my love of the outdoors and why I'm an environmental historian, and feeling the need to protect the environment and to educate people on the history of our use of the environment and the natural resources. And so Sigurd Olson was very much a part of this because it was his push for wilderness. And it really started with the Canoe area, the Quetico-Superior area there, and what became known as the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, when it was officially designated as federal wilderness in the 1970s. But prior to that, it had a long history. Like much of the northern Great Lakes region, it had faced the axes and saws of the lumbermen. And then in the 20th century, there were proposals to build large dams and power plants, hydroelectric power in the region there. And that led to a huge fight that Olson was part of to prevent that, to block that, and to make it a wilderness area. They won eventually, but it was very much a controversial issue in the local, for the locals there, because like much of northern Great Lakes region in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and in Minnesota, is that these projects meant jobs. After the lumber industry kind of died off, or the mining industry in Michigan, iron and copper mining, iron mining in Wisconsin and in Minnesota, there weren't a lot of other jobs available. So this was something that many of the locals felt was very important. And it was causing a fight you needed to let them know that having this wilderness here is important too. And it does lead to jobs as well. There's other ways to, for economic Tourism is important for the economy. So we see this fight all the time. Currently in Michigan, in the Western Upper Peninsula, there is controversy about a proposed copper mine to once again go in near Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park. Wilderness, right in its title. So you can see there is always a cycle, it's cyclical history here of these things happening. So Olson is one of my heroes, and I made the trek to Ely, Minnesota in 2005. It was a very circuitous route because I started in Grayling and I went down to Chicago, not because that's where Olson was from, but to visit friends there. And then I went out to Iowa to visit friends. And then in Des Moines, I got on Interstate 35 and I headed north all the way up to Duluth, and then followed up on U.S. highway and state highways to Ely, and camped in the Superior National Forest. And it was on my first night camping there that as I lie in my tent, I listened to wolves howling off in the distance. They were serenading me as I fell asleep. For me, that was the singing wilderness. So as Sigurd Olson spoke about, the singing wilderness can be of many different things. And I've felt that before in many places. And that was particularly one that hit to my heart because I was in Sigurd Olson's backyard. Now, unfortunately, at the time that I visited there, his home, which is now open to the public, it is the headquarters for the Listening Point Foundation that was created by his son to kind of carry on some of the work of Sigurd Olson. They now own it, and it is their headquarters. But that was privately owned house at the time. And then his cabin on Burnside Lake called Listening Point, and we'll talk about Listening Point here later in the episode. That was open, but only on a seasonal basis. So I had come in early September after Labor Day, and it was already closed for the season, so I was not able to get out there and to experience his Listening Point. And that is another thing that we'll talk about, is how we all have our own listening point. But while I was there and I was hiking in the Superior National Forest along a lake called Bass Lake, which was part of that Boundary Waters region that Sig would canoe through. And although I did not canoe, I did hike, I camped. But as I'm hiking through there, I stopped in one spot to, I pulled out a snack and water out of my knapsack, my day pack. And I'm sitting there just enjoying the late summer weather. It was, northern Minnesota, but it was the second week of September, and it was in the 70s or maybe 80 that day. So it was beautiful weather. And I'm sitting there and coming down out of a tree, just climbing down and stopping and peering at me often, was a pine marten, also known as an American marten. And these are of the Mustelidae family. They're very closely related to mink and weasels, but they live up in the tops of trees. They live in either mostly evergreen forests, but also in deciduous and hardwood forest as well. And this was an area of a lot of pine, some white pine, but mostly red pine. So this was perfect habitat for this little fellow. And as he came down, he was keeping an eye on me. He was not all that very shy at all, but it was another singing wilderness moment for me. These are animals that we have in Michigan, but they mostly disappeared at one point. Extirpation based on loss of habitat, or in the case of wolves, predation by humans. And they've all slowly started to come back. We have pine marten, American marten that came back, that were reintroduced in the Upper Peninsula, and also in a couple of spots in the Lower Peninsula. But wolves, as we know, they were pretty much came back on their own. They were not reintroduced to Michigan. They just slowly came in from nearby places like Minnesota and Wisconsin, to where they have a good population in the Upper Peninsula once again. And it's all because of the health of our forests. But I'm digressing, getting back onto Sigurd Olson. I really had these fields in his area, and it just made it so special. And I've always wanted to share a little bit of Olson and his writings and his personal views, what he did with others. So I'm having that opportunity today. So I told you a little bit about his biography. In 1947, he did resign from his position at Ely Junior College so he could become a writer full time. But that was just prior to that. He spent a year in post-war Germany after the end of World War II, teaching servicemen. They're in schools that were helping them to kind of improve. Many of the men had not graduated high school or had just barely graduated. Some of them quit school early to enlist. So it was a way, because of his background in teaching in high school and college, he was one of the civilian teachers there. But he realized what he wanted to do was be a full-time writer. And so he did that, working as a writer, writing articles, speaking, and as I mentioned, writing The Singing Wilderness that he finally was able to be published. But he also led numerous canoe trips. He no longer was an owner of the canoe outfitter in Ely, but he went on these many trips with not necessarily well-known people, but people of influence. And one of the great books of his that I read that I love is called The Lonely Land. And The Lonely Land was his third book, published in 1961, and it recounts a trip that he did with several men, mostly Canadian, because this was up in Saskatchewan that they did this trip, but also a Dutchman, and they were Eric Morris, Dennis Coolican, Blair Fraser, Tony Lovink, and Elliot Roger, and Omand Solant. They were all involved. They were all experienced outdoorsmen, and they loved the same life that Sigurd Olson did. And Sigurd was their bourgeois, or their canoe leader, and they followed along the Churchill River in northern Saskatchewan, and it was part of following the voyageurs along through there, both the Hudson Bay and the Northwest Company fur traders who used the routes there to get into the fur country. That was really the first use by Europeans of the forests in North America, was for fur. Trading with the indigenous people, the native tribes in that part of Canada, mostly the Cree. And but The Lonely Land is a great account of their trip. Now, they went downstream. Of course, most of the voyageurs would start their trips going upstream, coming from as far east as Montreal, but also from Mackinac Island or Fort William in what's now Thunder Bay, Ontario, or Grand Portage, which is right there on the border of Minnesota and Ontario on Lake Superior, and going inland, or also coming from Hudson Bay, the Hudson Bay Company, coming in from Hudson Bay. And so they would be going up country into the wilderness to trade with the natives, the First Nations, as they're known in Canada, Native Americans here in the United States, but was traditionally called Indians through much of the historical period. So they read accounts they had with them of the various fur traders that traversed the area there, and so they could kind of follow in journals of what they were doing, what was going on in their various locations. It's a great read, and I read that one. I don't know which book it was that I mean, in order that I read them. I read them as I could get my hands on them. And I found that book in a used bookshop in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, first edition books near Brevoort in the Upper Peninsula, if you ever find your way in that area there. And it, like I said, it's a cracking adventure. And it kind of falls into some of my family history that I did not know at the time. But from my mom's Canadian relatives, we are descendant of some Northwest Company and Hudson Bay Company voyageurs, fur traders, a clerk for the Hudson Bay Company, and their Cree Indian wives. So I have a bit of the Métis in me. My grandmother was born in the Winnipeg, Manitoba region, and from her mother, that is the heritage that we have. So I kind of fall under a lot of this through my family history as well. So then I just keep going back and forth here just because of the way this is connected to me so much. He was a great advisor to people of leadership, as I mentioned. Stuart Udell, the Secretary of the Interior, he was part of his advisory group during the 1960s there, in between when he had been president of the National Parks Association and prior to him becoming the vice president and then the president of the Wilderness Society. And then once they were able to get the Wilderness Bill passed, Act passed, and the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness was listed. He stepped down, but he was among some of the earliest Earth Day celebrants. Senator Gaylord Nelson out of Wisconsin was one of the great leaders of Earth Day creation, and he and Sigurd Olson were honored by Northland College, where Sigurd attended in one of his hometowns of Ashland, Wisconsin. And they now have the Sigurd Olson Environmental Institute. They're located at Northland College, and it's carries on all of the studies and the importance of wilderness. Some of the things that he wrote about with wilderness that Sigurd did really is about also why it was wilderness necessary. And in 1944, he was asked by Devereux Butcher, the executive director of the National Parks Association, to write an article on wilderness for their magazine. And he had been, of course, a member of the National Parks Association. And as I mentioned, he would later become president of it. And he wrote the article during the time that he was living in Germany, working for the United States Army, teaching classes for them. And the article he wrote was called "We Need Wilderness." And I'm going to read excerpts of kind of a condensed version of the article here. A fleet of rocky, pine-crested islands floats between us and the western horizon. It is dusk in the wilderness, a time of quiet and sunset-colored waters. The white tents are pale against the dark forest. Canoes are overturned on the shore. Beds made, all equipment under cover, everything snug for the night. In the calm air, the smoke from our dying fire rises straight into the sky. A loon calls and is answered from a lake over the hills. For a moment, the timbered ridges echo and re-echo with their wild notes. A week ago, we had left the steel. One of my party was the head of a great corporation in Chicago, another a well-known surgeon from New York, and the third a judge from Washington, D.C. They had come north to get the feeling of wilderness, to renew companionships and associations almost forgotten during the mad rush of the war years. Like many others I have guided on wilderness expeditions, these were men in the prime, highly successful in their professions, suave and cultured, but they were fatigued and worn by responsibilities. In the great city, or worn by responsibilities in the great cities. Now they wanted to have fun. They wanted to forget for a while the enmeshing tentacles of civilization and industry, and for a few weeks to feel that old freedom they used to know. In camp each night, they sat near the water's edge and talked until dark. I watched these men for a week. Now freed of mental strain, taking vigorous, pleasurable exercise, and breathing pure air 24 hours a day, they became normal human beings with much of the spirit of the carefree boy about them. These, my companions on a wilderness cruise, had again discovered how a man can find release, where he can recapture his perspective and the calm of untroubled years, where he can shed responsibilities and know the meaning of freedom and the joys of simple living. They, like others I have known on wilderness expeditions of the past, have found it here. The untouched rivers and forests and lakes were the answer. Now they could return to the cities with peace in their hearts. With the coming of twilight, hermit thrushes were singing in the hills behind us. From a nearby cove came the disturbed quacking of a mallard hen, then a splash, and a pair of mallards whistled overhead. A moose was the cause of their disturbance. We saw him wade into the shallows to feed on water lily plants there. Soon the evening star came out and hung like a lantern in the sky. The hermits were silent now, but a few white throats sounded their clear notes back in the hills. The turbulent world of civilization was far away. Noisy, dirty, bustling cities, like nightmares, seemed no part of reality. According to Webster, wilderness is a trackless waste uninhabited by man. To the people of America, as typified by the men who were with me on this particular trip, it is far more than that. It is something so closely tied up with their traditions, so tightly woven into their cultural backgrounds, their emotions and philosophies of life, that it cannot be ignored or neglected. Wilderness to the people of America is a spiritual necessity and an antidote to the high pressure of modern life, a means of regaining serenity and equilibrium. I have found that people go to the wilderness for many things, but the most important of these is perspective. They may think they go for the fishing or the scenery or companionship, but in reality it is something far deeper. They go to the wilderness for the good of their souls. They slowly realize that they are in tune with sun and stars and all natural things, and with that knowledge comes happiness and contentment. I believe this need of wilderness is inherent in most of us, even those seemingly farthest removed from it by civilized living. The cities may cover it up, make us forget temporarily, but deep underneath is an inherent urge for naturalness and simplicity, and a way of life different from the one we know. Henry Thoreau sensed the need of mankind when he said, "We can never have enough of nature. We must be refreshed by the sight of vast and titanic features, the wilderness with its living and decaying trees. We need to witness our own limits transgressed and some a life pasturing freely where we never wander." There is a school of thought that considers wilderness solely as an opportunity for nature study and scientific research and sees no spiritual value in the effect of wild country on those who come in contact with it. These people lack vision, for if they understood the primary purpose of the accumulation of knowledge generally, they would know that unless such effort results in furthering man's sense of companionship and understanding of the earth, and thereby contributes to his spiritual contentment and happiness, it has not achieved its purpose. There is another group made up of practical-minded individuals who see no sense in setting aside an area for aesthetic or recreational purposes. This group considers wilderness devotees as irresponsible wildlifers who have gone off the deep end in their enthusiasm for the out of doors. They look at the last remaining bits of primitive America as a final opportunity to get rich quick in the best pioneer tradition. They are the ones who would dam Yellowstone Lake, cut the last sequoias, and convert the canoe country of the Quetico-Superior into a huge storage reservoir. To them, the wilderness has no other value than the practical, and they think it's criminal for resources to stand commercially unused. They also need the wilderness, but their need is blinded by greed. There is a third group, larger than all the rest. That is the great mass of recreation-minded Americans who see in the wilderness not an opportunity for exploitation or for the furtherance of knowledge, but rather as an opportunity to satisfy a vital spiritual deficiency within themselves. They are the ones who head into the wilderness regions because they must. Wilderness to them is a tonic, a panacea for nervousness and monotony. They go to it once a month or once a year, as a sick man might go to his physician. These people know that wilderness to them is a necessity if they are to keep their balance. To place a value on wilderness is as difficult as to speak of the value of a landmark or an heirloom in terms of money. There are certain things that cannot be evaluated because of their emotional appeal. Wilderness is in this category. While a certain area might have worth as a museum piece or because of certain economic factors, its real worth will always depend upon how people feel about it and what it does for them. If it contributes to spiritual welfare, if it gives them perspective and a sense of oneness with mountains, forests, or waters, or in any way at all enriches their lives, then the area is beyond price. It is hard to place a true value on wilderness, as it is to decide what type of wild country is the best. What one man needs and finds satisfying might not be at all what another requires. In the final analysis, each man knows within himself what it is he wants, and in each case his choice is tempered by his own past, his dreams and memories, his hopes for the future, and his ability to enjoy. Some can find their wilderness in tiny, hidden corners where through accident rather than design, man has saved just a breath of the primeval America. I know of a glen in the heart of a great city park system, a tiny, roaring canyon where many seeking solitude and beauty can find release. It is dark in there and damp, and in the heat of the summer it is cool. Ferns and lichens and liverworts cling to the rocks, and there grow flowers that thrive only in the shadows where the air is charged with mist. The water swirls through this canyon as it has for thousands of years, and the sounds are the sounds of a land far removed from civilization. A highway runs within 100 yards and cars pass almost overhead, but the rocks and trees screen it from view, and the only evidence of traffic is a vague hum that blends with the whisper of the wind and the music of rushing water. There, if a man wishes, he can regain in a swift moment the feeling of the wild and steal for a brief instant. Respite from the noise and confusion of a big city. There, if he has perspective, he may recharge his soul. There are men, however, who crave action and distance and far horizons beyond the steel. No little sanctuaries for them along the fringes of civilization. They must know the wild country and all that goes with it, must feel the bite of a tumpline on the portages, the desperate battling against waves on stormy lakes. They must know hunger and thirst and privation and the companionship men know only on the out trails of the world. When after days of paddling and packing, they find themselves on some bare glaciated point, 100 miles away, miles from town, and stand there gazing down a great wilderness waterway, listening to the loons and seeing the wild rocky islands floating in the sunset, they too know the meaning of communion with nature. Stephen Leacock, when asked why he persisted in living in Toronto instead of returning to his beloved England, replied that he liked living in Toronto because it was so close to the wilderness of Hudson Bay, that the very thought of the thousands of miles of barren country to the north gave him a sense of spaciousness and adventure that did him good. In that statement has voiced the feeling of thousands of people who, like him, though they may never penetrate the backcountry, nevertheless enjoy the feeling of living close to it. For these, the wilderness is just as much an inspiration for those who travel through it by horse, by canoe, dog team, or other primitive means. The very awareness of it gives to them that feeling of the frontier characteristic of all jumping off places. In such regions, the air itself seems rarefied and charged with something different that Thoreau might have called the early morning fragrance of the wild. Whatever their type and wherever they are found, be these wilderness places, large or small, mountains, lakes, deserts, swamps, or forests, they do fill a vital need. Gradually, wilderness has become a cultural necessity to us, the people of America. And while it does play an important recreational role, its real function will always be as a spiritual backlog in the high-speed, mechanical world in which we live. We have discovered that the presence of wilderness in itself is a balance wheel and an aid to equilibrium. Most Americans are not far removed from their pioneer ancestry, are still close enough to the covered wagon days and the era of backwoods settlement and farms so that they remember more than sense what they have lost. And being so close to it is not at all surprising that when production lines and speed and synthetic living seem more than they can bear, they instinctively head back to the wilderness where they know everything will be all right. Once returned to the old ways of living, their serenity comes back and they find that their capacity for enjoyment has not changed. That is what the wilderness means to America. In recognition of this almost general need of our people, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the various states have wisely set aside many areas that may be classified as wilderness, areas dedicated to the spiritual welfare of all. They vary in size from the 3 million acre Salmon River Wilderness area of Idaho, a region large enough for a man to travel for days without crossing his own tracks, to areas only a few square miles in extent, museum bits of the once vast primeval wilderness of North America. Far-sighted conservationists have fought hasty developmental programs that had as their goal the exploitation of the few remaining sections of wilderness. Sometimes they have won, but more often they have lost, due to the fact that, as people, Americans still do not realize the importance of wilderness preservation as an investment in future happiness. The idea that America is a land of freedom and limitless opportunity is perhaps responsible for our lethargy in saving more of the wild than we have. A few short decades ago, wilderness was something that had to be fought and overcome, the one great hindrance to the opening and development of the continent. We remember the pioneer days when the great plantations of pine were stripped and burned, when huge reclamation projects drained swamps and lowered the water tables to the danger point, when power projects were thought the only legitimate uses of streams. The old, destructive, cut-out and get-out philosophy of those days is still very much alive in our thinking, so that it is not surprising to find many who even now view the few wilderness regions we have set aside as a challenge to move in and make a fortune in spite of the outraged sentiment of those who do seek their value. We see these interests constantly at work, backed by powerful lobbies, interests which call for the cutting of the last stands of virgin timber, the exploitation of the last untouched reserves of the continent. They make the preservation of any section of wild country a constant battle, and place the comparatively small reservations we have set aside in constant jeopardy. The existence of this element in our population makes necessary the utmost vigilance on the part of governmental agencies in charge of the administration of our parks and forests, as well as on the part of those organizations scattered throughout the land that understand what it takes, what is at stake. The reservations already created are woeful inadequate to meet the need and give to the people of all parts of the United States the opportunity of wilderness recreation. This is especially true in the large centers of population, yet it is here that the need is greatest and opposition strongest. One highly encouraging aspect of the wilderness problem is the realization that as a nation we are approaching cultural maturity. No young nation ever worries overmuch about the intangible assets of wilderness, as long as its great battle is to subdue wilderness and carve our cities and roads and farms from the wild. Now, for the first time, we are able to look back and see where our mistakes and short-sighted policies have brought us, and at long last we are slowly emerging from the old pioneer concept that governed our thinking of the past 3 centuries. We can see that we have squandered a national heritage of beauty and wealth and have only a few places left to remind us of the continent's past primeval glory. We know now just how valuable these fragments of the old America have become to us as a people. We see them now in a new light and realize that in addition to being museum pieces of the past, they are vital to our happiness and investments in national character. We also know that if we are to retain our contentment and balance, then we must never lose our contact with the earth, never forget the pioneer traditions of independence and resourcefulness under primitive conditions, never for a moment exchange the philosophy of the backwoods settler for the comparative ease of the modern city. To give the people of this country an opportunity to renew their old associations as to find themselves and their real qualities, to rejuvenate their spirits through a simple living in the out-of-doors is the real purpose of the preservation of wilderness. National Parks Magazine, January to March, 1946. 80 years later, what Sigurd Olson wrote in this article still is important today, as many of the things he writes about is happening once again in our country. Protecting our natural resources, our wilderness, our places of beauty has always been a very important object for many people in our country. And Sigurd Olson just happened to be one of the best voices to espouse that for the public to hear. So it's, as I've said, he's been a very important figure in my life and my professional life. And I'm glad I've been able to share a little bit of this with you today. As I mentioned, Sigurd Olson wrote 9 books, and I'll have a list of the books in the description of this podcast episode so you can explore his writings on your own. There were also a number of books of compilations of his writings, biographies that I'll also share in that as well. But his second book, the one that came directly after The Singing Wilderness, was another one of his well-known books to many. It's called Listening Point. And Listening Point isn't so much about the wilderness as we think of it as an untouched, pristine area, but about finding your place in the wild on your own. And it doesn't have to be a perfect wilderness area, but just a place that gives you that sense of what he called listening point. So again, the introductory essay from his book of the same title, Listening Point. For a long time, I had looked for such a place, explored the country within reach of home for some spot that held what I wanted, and I wanted many things. There should be sunsets and moonrises and northern lights, a little beach and water that was crystal clear, glaciated rocks, a level spot for a tent, and a place for a cabin too. Above all, there should be vistas into wide open space, loons with the dusk full of their calling, seagulls screaming in the mornings, and the long, lazy sweep of them as they come in to feed. Such things were important to the purpose I had in mind, for through their magic I would be more aware and alive and sense what I had known on many exploring expeditions of the past. One day, after a long search, I found my point. I had come through the woods and swamps off the end of the road and was suddenly out of the brush and trees on an open shelf of rock. There it was, as I had dreamt, a composite picture of all the places in the north that I had known and loved. I stood there for a long time, then walked over the gray ledges to the end of the point. Its tip faced the west, and across a mile of open water were clusters of rocky pine-clad islands with narrow channels between them. Then I saw the campsite, a flat patch of bearberry on a shelf above the water's edge. High enough to be safe from the waves, of a place I would have chosen with joy on any canoe trip I had ever been on. Here I could roll up in my sleeping bag and feel I was still far in the bush. The crest of the point was smooth, but fringing it all around were the pines, the gnarled, windswept ones, the twisted, weather-beaten specimens for whom life had been hard, some of them a century of age and still no bigger than a post. Back of the crest was a game trail leading through a colonnade of tall trees toward the ridges in the east. I discovered there was not only one glaciated spit of rock, but several. They lay like an open hand, with the widespread thumb holding a crescent bay between it and the palm. The fingers were half closed, the middle one facing the sunsets, the index the moonrise, the little finger the wild, free expanses of the North Channel. I followed the deer trail through the pines and down to the bay. There was just a chance that the southwest winds of thousands of years might have had their effect on the rocks of that little cove. It was screened by a fringe of alder and willow, but when I stepped onto a flat rock beyond them, there was a tiny strip of white sand sloping gradually into the deep, and the water so clear I could see the ripple marks far out from shore. Sheltered from the cold northwest gales, the little bay would always be warming and swimming a joy. The end of the thumb was a bold rocky ledge with a pine tree standing there alone. I started over there and halfway found a stand of Norway pines and clusters of white birch scattered among huge, craggy rocks. From the top of one of them, I could see the beach and the point itself and the vistas across to the islands, and knew the search was over. Here was everything I had ever hoped to find. I would never own the water or the horizons, but the sunsets, the moonrises, and the vistas would belong as much to me as though written into the deed itself. I felt rich that day with my good fortune. Though it might soon be mine, I realized that even so I would be a tenant leasing the enjoyment of this bit of the earth's crust for a few short years. The point has seen the Indians and voyageurs, the prospectors and loggers, had been stopping places for countless travelers long before I found it. They had seen its storms and northern lights and had watched its vistas before I came. From this one place I would explore the entire north and all life, including my own. I could look to the stars and feel that here was a focal point of great celestial triangles, a point as important as any one place on the planet. For me, it would be a listening post from which I might even hear the music of the spheres. Wilderness sounds would be here, bird songs in the morning and at dusk. The aspen leaves would whisper and the pines as well, and in the sound of water and wind I would hear all that is worth listening for. I would come in all seasons, when the first buds of spring were painting the hillsides, when the sounds of summer made it seem as though the woods were pulsating with life. I would be here in the autumns, watching the pageantry of color. In the winter, when the lake was frozen and still and the point deep with snow, I would come to listen and feel and to recapture for a little while the old joys I had known. I must leave it as beautiful as I found it. Nothing must ever happen there that might detract in the slightest from what it now had. I would enjoy it and discover it, all that was to be found there, and learn as time went on that here, perhaps, was all I might ever hope to know. As I sat there on the rock, I realized that, in spite of the closeness of civilization and the changes that hemmed it in, this remnant of the old wilderness would speak to me of silence and solitude, of belonging and wonder and beauty. Though the point was only a small part of the vastness reaching far to the Arctic, from it I could survey the whole. While it would be mine for only a short time, this glaciated shore, with its twisted trees and caribou moss, would grow into my life and into the lives of all those who shared it with me. I named this place Listening Point because only when one comes to listen, Only when one is aware and still, and can things be seen and heard, everyone has a listening point somewhere. It does not have to be in the north or close to the wilderness, but some place of quiet where the universe can be contemplated with awe. The adventures that have been mine can be known by anyone. Listening Point by Sigurd F. Olson in the book Listening Point, published in 1958. Sigurd Olson would come to have a cabin moved to Listening Point. It was an old Finnish cabin, and he had that and a Finnish sauna moved to the site, and it would be his retreat for the rest of his life. He died at Listening Point in January 1982 of a heart attack while snowshoeing out there. Listening Point was then given by his son to the foundation that was created in his honor, the Listening Point Foundation. And it is now a place for people to come visit to understand more of the life and the creed of Sigurd F. Olson. And it's the center of, of this feeling, this attitude of the importance of wilderness and of the outdoors, the preservation of wilderness, the environment, that I hold deeply. And I hope that as a listener of this, you feel some of that as well. My final thought on this goes to my own personal canoe adventures that I've had. I've had two in my life with my close friend, Rob Rowe, a Canadian friend of mine that we met many years ago through museum conferences out in Nova Scotia in 2002. And Rob and I connected very quickly because just like with Ben Carr, we were kindred spirits of lovers of the outdoors and nature. Rob worked for Parks Canada's historic sites, and I was working for the state of Michigan's historic sites. So we had that connection, and that grew into a good friendship. And finally, after many years talking, we went on our first canoe trip together, and it was in 2017, and we drove up from his home in Waterloo, Ontario, to the Temagami area of Canada, of Ontario, north of Sudbury. It would be north of Lake Huron and east of Lake Superior. And we spent several days, about a week, canoeing through Temagami Lake and Cross Lake and portaging through smaller lakes. And some of those portages made me feel like a voyageur, truthfully. But in our last night, before we got back to the landing where Rob's truck was at and where we would take out, we spent at a campsite that had been a native and indigenous fishing camp at different times. We were in early September, and this camp was not in use at the time, but they had frames set up for tents. These were just, branches, small logs that were nailed together. And it was a nice clearing. It got us out of the wind. It had been a very windy paddle that day, and we were able to relax. And as we built a fire that evening, had our tent set up underneath the shadows of the frames of the native tents framework that they would have there for their large canvas tents, probably with wood stoves in them because they would have been during cold periods of the fall. But we're sitting there relaxing around this fire. And it wasn't so much that we heard something, but we sensed it. And up above our heads, and we flipped on our flashlights, and there was a flying squirrel that had just soared right across from one tree to another just above our heads. And we saw it on the tree trunk that it had landed on. And as our lights were still lit and facing up in the air, here came a second one. And it was just, I'm speechless about it. It was just magical for that to have happened. And that was truly my greatest feel of the singing wilderness that I've ever had. And thankfully had I not been friends with Rob, I never would have experienced this, because he was much more of a wilderness and outdoorsman through his life long, living in Canada and having gone to the Yukon and all over the provinces of Canada. He and his wife going on many trips, and he and his Canadian friends going on others. I felt honored that he took this Yank with him up to the northern woods of Ontario to explore. Thank you for listening. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled topics here in the next couple of weeks. Next week, maybe Craig Kasmer, or it might be Bruce Lynn of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum. And if not one, it'll be the other, and then the other one will come the following week. And then we'll finish up with the final episode of the season, speaking about DeWard, the last great logging boomtown in Michigan. So we'll end our season with talking about logging again, but kind of the aftermath and what it's like with today. So thanks for listening. And like always, if you enjoyed the show, please like it. Please subscribe and tell a friend. As always, the best way to have this grow is to let people know about it. And slowly our listenership is growing. As I'm recording this, 7 episodes have been aired now, and there is the growth in this. So I'm hoping that by the time this one runs, I believe this is the 10th episode, then we will certainly have, starting to build more and more, and going into the next season that hopefully will be recorded and soon and will be launched in June. So thanks again for listening to North Country History with Rob Berg, and we'll talk again next week. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.